So in this case study, we will discuss an issue with informed consent based around a story of a counselor named Kiara. Now, Kiara is not a school counselor, but we will discuss further how her case aligns with school counseling and how her issue can happen easily in a school setting. So, in the case study, Kiara is a counselor. She neglects to discuss the details of confidentiality with a particular client. She states that privacy is respected throughout her sessions and that whatever is said in the office will stay in the office. She then attends a seminar discussing the issues of malpractice and the importance of informed consent as a means of professional protection, meaning as it relates to liability. It is soon after this conference this particular client starts to express suicidal ideation. Now, Kiara hastily drafts an informed consent form sourced from the recent conference and asks her client to sign it. The client signs the form but feels very, very confused. He stops mentioning his suicidal ideation and later proceeds to cancel therapy with Kiara. Kiara does not seek to mend the client's abrupt cancellation or inquire his reasoning for ceasing therapy. So there are a couple ways that we're going to approach this case study. The first way is we're going to correlate to how this can happen in the school setting. So it can happen in a school setting, especially if the school department or the school counseling department is new and unestablished and unaligned with Ask a National model. Things like appropriate paperwork, administering that paperwork to the student and to the parents can be overlooked in a new and unestablished counseling department. And if the counseling department is unaligned with Ask a National model. Another way that this could happen is if the counseling department and the school is completely aligned and completely ready to tackle these types of situations. However, the school counselor may experience some burnout, or he or she may not be fully attentive in a counseling session, and therefore neglect to mention the nuances of confidentiality. So, what are the ethical dilemmas posed in this case scenario? There are a few ways that we're going to look at this. So, first, we have to address the emotional and intellectual issues. We have to see whether or not their ASCA ethical codes aligned with this case scenario or pertaining this case scenario, as well as ACA ethical codes, which is American Counseling Association codes. Then we have to consider the student's developmental level. Then we will consider what the rights of all the parties are involved. So the parties involved are the student, the counselor, the school in which they are present in, and the parent of the student. Now, consider the principles below. How does the case study impact the counselor's character and integrity? So these are core values that ASCA has deemed central to a school counselor's role in a school and in their counseling practice. So beneficence is to provide a benefit to the student and to the environment, the school environment, to make sure that the client has a sense of autonomy. That means that the student is basically reserved the right to choose whatever he or she feels is the best option for him or herself. Non-maleficence, which means you are not harming anybody involved. Loyalty to the school and to the student and to the value of the school counselor, and justice. So approaching each ethical dilemma as just as possible. Now we will further discuss what are the possible actions and consequences dealing with this ethical dilemma. And in order to do that appropriately, we will have to look and go back to the Code of Ethics provided by the ACA, American Counseling Association, and then later the ASCA Code of Ethics, which is the American School Counseling Association. So first, in the American Counseling Association, it clearly states that clients have the freedom to choose whether to enter into or remain in a counseling relationship, and they need adequate information about the counseling process and the counselor. So this requires the counselor to self-disclose a little bit about him or herself, and then to provide information that the counselee may want or need in order to make an informed decision on whether to choose this therapy and to enter into this therapy or not. So in this case, This would be closely aligned to the value of autonomy, right? So the student has autonomy on whether or not they want to come and see the counselor for an individual counseling relationship. Now, in this case, scenario, Kiara did not really provide the adequate information about the counseling process and about confidentiality. So that was really the first issue with what happened. Now, in Code of Ethics A2B, it states that clients have the right to confidentiality and to be provided with explanation of its limits. Now, Kiara did not really provide that for the client, so she was not really explaining to him really was a boy in this case, that in terms of self-harm or harming others or situations regarding vulnerable parties, that the school counselor would have to reach out and maybe involve other authorities. This explanation was not provided to the student, and therefore, in the beginning of the counseling relationship, so when it was mentioned in the middle, and especially after self-harm was involved or suicidal ideation was involved, the counselor became very confused. In terms of the ASCA ethical code of conduct, we will bring in another party, which is the parents and the guardians involved, and what their rights are in this case. So in the ASCA ethical code of conduct, it states that the school counselor must inform parents and guardians or appropriate authorities when a student poses a serious and foreseeable risk of harm to self or others. When feasible, this is to be done after careful deliberation and consultation with other appropriate professionals. School counselors inform students of the school counselor's legal and ethical obligation to report the concern to the appropriate authorities, unless it is appropriate to withhold this information to protect the student. So, for example, if the student will run away if you told him or her that they would be calling their parents. The consequence of the risk of not giving parents or guardians a chance to intervene on behalf of their child is too great. Even if the danger appears relatively remote, parents should be notified. So the first step to ethical decision-making is gathering the facts. So before I go through the steps, I would like to mention that I'm going to look at ethical decision-making and the 9 steps of ethical decision-making through 2 different lenses. The first one will be the ethical, the 9 steps mentioned in the ASCA Code of Ethics. And the second one will be ethical decision-making through a proposed 9-step plan from Douglas May of the University of Kansas. So the first step is gathering the facts. So May suggests that the first step is gathering the facts. So what we'll look at is what really happened in this situation. Now, you have Kiara, who did not administer informed consent in the beginning. And then she neglected to mention the nuances and the limits of confidentiality. She drafted an informed consent form after suicide ideation was mentioned and after she knew about really her own liability. And then after that, when the client stopped mentioning suicide ideation and when he canceled and when he left therapy, she did not seek to understand what really was his reasoning behind canceling therapy. So those were the facts, the 4 main facts of the case scenario. Now, when we look at it emotionally, Kiara probably had a feeling of guilt and confusion. She was probably very flustered and unsure of what to do when the client started mentioning suicide ideation and right after she was really warned about professional liability. And then on the client's part, he probably felt a sense of betrayal and mistrust of the counselor. Now, intellectually, drafting the informed consent form in the middle of therapy was not really the best decision for her, and then not following up with cancellation. So those 2 facts are really what defined this case scenario as an ethical dilemma. The next part of ethical decision making was to make sure that the counselor